At 2:13 a.m., the corridors of Kensington Palace were lit only by a row of low-burning wall lamps, soft pools of amber light stretching across polished floors that had carried centuries of measured footsteps. The palace did not sleep. It never truly did. But at that hour, it exhaled differently, slower, quieter, like a living thing conserving breath. The rain traced faint lines across the tall windows overlooking the courtyard. Beyond the gates, London was hushed beneath the weight of midnight. Inside, discipline held its post. And then, a whisper, a junior footman, barely 3 months into royal service, stood frozen outside the private apartments. His gloves trembled, not from cold, but from the knowledge that certain truths were not meant to travel upward. He had tried to ignore it the first night. He had told himself it was temporary. But 2 nights in a row, the folded blanket had not moved. He cleared his throat once before knocking softly on the private study door. Inside, papers lay arranged in neat order beneath a brass lamp. Prince William did not startle at the interruption. He rarely did. He lifted his eyes calmly. "Yes." The footman stepped inside, careful not to let his shoes echo. "Your Royal Highness, I believe there may have been an oversight regarding Princess Charlotte's temporary accommodation." William's gaze sharpened, but his voice did not rise. "What kind of oversight?" The pause stretched too long. "She was placed on the floor, sir, due to refurbishment in the adjoining nursery suite." Silence, the kind that presses against the lungs. William stood slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just slowly. "The floor?" "Yes, sir." A folded quilt. It was to be temporary. "How many nights?" "2, sir." The echo of boots on marble wasn't just sound. It was discipline made audible. William did not rush down the corridor. He walked with a steadiness that suggested control. But something inside him had shifted. A fractured line, thin, silent, spreading. The palace walls had seen wars declared and treaties signed. They had witnessed abdications and reconciliations. But they had rarely seen a future king walk toward his child's room at that hour, without ceremony. The nursery door was slightly ajar. Soft nightlight glow. The faint hum of a monitor. The quiet rhythm of a child asleep. He pushed the door open. And there it was. A folded blanket. Directly on polished hardwood. The bed frame, temporarily removed for refinishing, left an empty rectangle against the wall. But no secondary cot had been installed. No temporary arrangement beyond the most minimal solution. Princess Charlotte slept peacefully, one arm draped over the edge of the blanket. Unaware, William knelt. He touched the floor lightly. Cold, hard, unforgiving. For a moment, he closed his eyes. The monarchy teaches restraint before reaction, silence before correction, private discipline over public display. But fatherhood does not recognize hierarchy. It recognizes only protection. The camera would drift outward now, down the corridor, past oil portraits of monarchs who endured childhoods governed by distance and duty. Boys sent away at 8. Girls trained to curtsy before they could comprehend loss. Tradition, they called it. Endurance builds strength. But endurance without compassion breeds something else. William stood. He did not wake her. He did not summon the night staff immediately. He simply looked once more at the polished floor beneath that thin layer of fabric, and something ancient, something unspoken within palace culture, quietly snapped. Before dawn, 2 senior household managers were summoned to a private briefing room. No raised voices, no spectacle, but the air was different. Who authorized this accommodation? William asked, standing rather than sitting. A shuffle of papers. "Sir, the refurbishment required immediate action. The reassignment protocol permitted temporary floor bedding under emergency classification." "Emergency," William repeated. It was considered acceptable for short duration. "For whom?" he asked. Silence. "Was I informed?" "No, sir. It was deemed operational." There it was, operational. A word so sterile, it could bleach empathy from stone. William folded his hands behind his back. 2 nights, he said quietly. 2 nights on hardwood. It was assumed. That assumption ends now. The sentence did not echo. It landed, By 4:30 a.m., discreet security escorts accompanied two officials from the private wing to administrative quarters. Not dismissed, yet, but removed. The palace machinery had begun to shift. Word travels differently in royal households. Not through shouting, through absence. A senior chamberlain not present at breakfast. A door locked that is normally open. Staff moving in pairs rather than clusters. Meanwhile, upstairs, Charlotte's room was already being reconfigured. A temporary antique daybed, unused for decades, was installed within the hour. Fresh linen, proper mattress, silent efficiency. But William remained in the corridor, watching, not the work, the faces. Some confused, some defensive, some quietly aware that something larger than furniture had just moved. Because for centuries, internal correction was invisible. Errors were addressed quietly, internally, almost surgically. The crown did not fracture in public. It adjusted in shadow. But this felt different. This was not an adjustment. It was a reckoning. Hours later, as morning light filtered to the palace windows, Catherine joined him in the study. She had already been told. She slept through it, William said. Catherine's expression did not break, but her eyes darkened. She won't remember, she said softly. No, he replied, but I will. The camera would linger here. Two parents standing within walls built to outlast governments. Walls that once believed emotional endurance was virtue. But what followed next, the narrator would say gently, would question whether endurance without tenderness is strength at all. By midday, renovation logs were requested, accommodation ledgers reviewed, email chains traced. The instruction that allowed floor bedding was technically compliant, but contextually hollow. And then a detail, no signature, a notation approving temporary arrangement without formal review clearance. And signed, the palace had rules for everything. Even silence had procedure. So who bypassed it? William stared at the ledger longer than necessary. Because if someone had deliberately avoided review, then this was not oversight. It was choice. The courtyard was quiet again by evening. Staff moved carefully, measured, but something fundamental had shifted inside those walls. A father had opened a door at 2:13 a.m., and a future king had decided that some traditions do not deserve inheritance. The nursery had been restored before sunrise, the blanket removed, the hardwood polished once more until it reflected the ceiling's carved plasterwork as though nothing had ever disturbed it. But the echo of that discovery still lingered in the corridor. By mid-morning, the emotional tremor of the night before had begun to harden into something more structured. Not anger, not outrage, something colder. Inquiry. Behind the dignified facade of Kensington Palace existed an intricate system of internal governance. Precise, layered, and centuries in the making. The public saw ceremony. The nation saw symbolism. But within those stone walls, a private infrastructure operated with near military discipline. Private secretaries, household marshals, equerries, domestic supervisors, child security officers, renovation coordinators. Each role distinct, each decision documented. Or at least, it was supposed to be. The camera would drift now through administrative offices tucked discreetly behind formal reception rooms, spaces unseen by visitors who toured only gilded halls. Here, fluorescent light replaced chandeliers. Filing cabinets replaced portraits. William entered without announcement. Staff stood instinctively. Please sit, he said. But no one did. On the long oak table lay a spread of documents retrieved at his request. Renovation schedules, temporary accommodation charts, security reassignment protocols. He did not sit either. Walk me through the chain of authorization, he said calmly. A senior household marshal cleared his throat. The nursery flooring required refinishing due to structural humidity concerns. Sir, estimated disruption, 48 hours. And the alternative bedding plan? Emergency classification per Section 12 of Domestic Contingency Protocol. William's eyes remained steady. Emergency implies necessity. What constituted necessity? The marshal hesitated. The contractor's schedule was immovable. The daybed was in restoration. No secondary cot available in immediate inventory. Was procurement contacted? Not initially, sir. Why? A pause too long for comfort. It was assessed as a short-term inconvenience. Inconvenience. The word resurfaced like an unwelcome tide. William nodded once. Continue. The machinery of the Crown functioned on layered assumption. If a decision fell within allowable parameters, it rarely climbed higher unless marked exceptional. Over time, efficiency replaced vigilance. The protocol did not demand cruelty. It permitted minimalism. And minimalism, when unexamined, could resemble neglect. Hours later, the review deepened. Renovation logs were cross-referenced with security staffing adjustments. Child proximity guidelines, documents designed specifically to prevent emotional or physical discomfort, were retrieved from archive storage. The guidelines were explicit. No child of the household was to be placed in provisional accommodation without approval from both the private secretary and the principal parent. Yet the approval column remained blank and signed. William studied the ledger under soft office light. The absence was louder than ink. Who bypassed secondary review? He asked quietly. Silence moved through the room like a draft. A junior administrative officer shifted in his chair. It may have been redirected for internal clearance, sir. Redirected where? To avoid overburdening your office. There was again the culture of deference. The palace was built upon it. Respect for hierarchy. Shielding the principal from operational minutiae. Preserving royal focus for matters of state. But what is minutiae to a system can be monumental to a child. William walked to the window, overlooking the inner courtyard. Guards paced in ceremonial stillness beyond the gates. He had grown up within the structure. He knew its rhythms, its strengths, its blind spots. The Crown had endured precisely because it did not overreact. Yet sometimes, the refusal to react was a greater failure. But what followed next, the narrator would murmur, was not simply administrative correction. It was excavation. By early afternoon, email records were requested from the renovation coordinator's office. Internal correspondence revealed a subtle shift in tone over several exchanges. One message stood out. Temporary floor arrangement acceptable for short duration. Do not escalate. Household stability preferred. No signature. No formal approval. Just a directive. William read it twice. Who authored this? A senior aide leaned forward. The metadata suggests routing through a shared administrative terminal. Sir. Shared, which meant accountability diffused. Responsibility blurred. He turned back toward the table. This is not a structural failure, he said evenly. It is a cultural one. The room held its breath. Because culture cannot be corrected with memo, it must be confronted. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Palace Stone, another detail surfaced. A complaint, formally submitted by a nanny assigned to Charlotte's rotation, dated the first evening of the refurbishment. Language careful, respectful, concern regarding child comfort, request reconsideration, a provisional bedding arrangement. The complaint had been acknowledged, but not escalated. Instead, it had been redirected to domestic operations with the annotation, handled. The camera would linger here, on that single word stamped in tidy digital font, a word capable of burying discomfort beneath procedure. William closed the file slowly. Why was this not brought forward? The private secretary answered, voice measured. Historically, domestic adjustments of the scale remain internal unless safety is compromised. And you did not consider the safety? It was not categorized as such. He nodded once. Then the category is wrong. The machinery of the Crown excelled at ceremony. It executed state banquets with flawless precision. It coordinated security for global dignitaries with silent mastery. But ceremony could not cradle a sleeping child. Protocol could not soften hardwood. Evening approached. Staff rotated quietly. Conversations dropped to murmurs as he passed. In the long corridor outside administrative offices, William paused beside a portrait of a young monarch painted centuries earlier, solemn, distant, alone. Royal childhood had rarely been gentle. Letters from past generations, stored in archival vaults beneath the palace, documented structured detachment, boarding schools at 8, Nannies rotated for discipline rather than warmth. Emotional resilience prized above comfort. The system had been designed to produce monarchs, not children. And yet here stood a father determined to refuse inheritance of indifference. Meanwhile, behind closed office doors, staff whispered, not in defiance, in uncertainty. Because if deference was no longer sufficient, what replaced it? By 8 p.m., the review had expanded beyond the nursery. Temporary accommodation protocols across all royal residences were flagged for reassessment, including those at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. If one ensign notation existed here, others might exist elsewhere. The issue was no longer a room. It was precedent. Hours later, Catherine joined him again in the private sitting room. The day's weight hung visibly between them. They thought they were protecting you, she said quietly. From what? From inconvenience. He considered that. The crown can survive inconvenience, he replied. It cannot survive indifference. The firelight flickered against the mantelpiece. Outside, rain began again, soft against the glass. The palace felt colder. Not physically, institutionally. And then, a final discovery before midnight. The ensign notation in the accommodation ledger was time-stamped 17 minutes after a separate internal memo. That memo referenced an upcoming diplomatic briefing. One William had been preparing for late into the night. The implications settled heavily. The directive to avoid escalation may not have been about convenience. It may have been about optics. Avoid distraction. Preserve focus. Maintain composure. The system had chosen image over intimacy, and in doing so, it revealed its deepest flaw. William stood once more at the nursery threshold before retiring. Charlotte slept peacefully in her restored bed. She would never know the ledger entries, the unsigned approvals, the redirected complaints, but the institution would, because what he now understood was this. No system fails all at once. It erodes quietly, through unchecked assumptions, through language that sanitizes discomfort, through the belief that temporary hardship builds necessary strength. But strength built without empathy fractures under scrutiny. As the camera drifts upward above palace rooftops, London lights shimmer against the Thames. The monarchy remains intact. The guards remain stationed. The flag remains raised. Outwardly, nothing has changed. Inwardly, everything has. And in the administrative wing below, that single ensign notation continues to glow beneath fluorescent light, no longer invisible, because someone had intentionally bypassed the standard review process. And now, that choice would demand an answer. The ensign notation had not left his mind. All through the night, as rain whispered against the windows of Kensington Palace, the single absence of a name echoed louder than any accusation. Systems fail quietly, but intent leaves a fingerprint. By morning, the decision had been made. The long gallery would be prepared. The long gallery was not used for minor matters. It was a corridor of history. High ceilings ribbed with carved beams, oil portraits stretching in solemn procession along its walls. Monarchs watched from gilded frames. Victories and failures captured in varnish and silence. When summoned there, one did not mistake the gravity. The camera would move slowly now along the polished floor as senior household staff entered in measured sequence. Private secretary, household marshal, domestic operations director, renovation coordinator, 2 deputy aides. No press, no ceremony, only internal reckoning. William stood at the far end of the gallery, near a tall mullioned window where pale morning light cut through drifting cloud. He did not sit at the central table prepared for him. He waited. They formed a half circle at respectful distance. "Thank you for coming," he began, voice steady. No anger, no raised tone, but something immovable. "We are here because a protocol was followed," he said. And yet a failure occurred. A subtle shift among them. The private secretary inclined his head. "Your Royal Highness, we regret the discomfort caused. It was temporary." William's gaze sharpened, not theatrically, but decisively. Temporary is not the question. Silence gathered like fog. "The question," he continued, "is how a child of this household slept on hardwood for 2 nights under protection of a system designed to prevent precisely that." The domestic operations director stepped forward slightly. It fell within allowable contingency parameters, sir. Allowable? William repeated. A pause. Yes, sir. Emergency classification permitted provisional bedding. There was no emergency. The words landed without force yet carried weight. The renovation coordinator cleared his throat. The contractor schedule was immovable, William finished calmly. Yes, I have read the file. The camera would pan upward toward portraits above them. A young king in military regalia. A queen crowned at too early an age. Faces that endured childhood shaped by distance rather than tenderness. History watched. Who wrote the directive to avoid escalation? William asked. No one answered immediately. The household marshal shifted slightly. It was routed through domestic operations, sir. Authored by whom? A glance exchanged between two aides. The instruction was entered from a shared terminal. Convenient, William said softly. A current moved through the room. Because this was no longer about floorboards. It was about accountability. Hours earlier, William had reread the nanny's complaint. The careful phrasing. The deference. The subtle urgency masked as respect. Concern regarding child comfort. He retrieved a printed copy now and placed it on the central table. This was submitted the first evening, he said. Why was it redirected? The private secretary responded. It was assessed as manageable internally, to avoid unnecessary burden. On whom? On you, sir. A stillness followed. The phrase hung, exposed beneath centuries-old beams. William stepped closer to the table. You believe informing me that my daughter slept on hardwood would overburden me? No one spoke. The domestic operations director attempted composure. The intention was to preserve focus on scheduled diplomatic engagements. There was a sensitive briefing that evening. And there it was. Optics. Preservation of image. William's jaw tightened, but only briefly. So the calculation, he said evenly, was that hardwood for 48 hours was preferable to distraction for one. The private secretary swallowed. It was a judgment call. And whose judgment? The room held its breath. A senior aide, one who had served the household for over 2 decades, finally stepped forward. It was mine. The camera would narrow here, tight on the aide's expression, not defiant, not entirely apologetic, but certain. I authorized non-escalation, he said, within acceptable parameters. Why? William asked. Because temporary discomfort has historically been considered tolerable within royal upbringing. The words settled like dust over fragile glass. William's voice did not rise. Historically. Yes, sir. The aide continued, emboldened by precedent. Members of the royal family have endured far greater inconvenience in youth. It was believed, respectfully, that resilience is not diminished by minor hardship. The gallery seemed to contract. Portraits above them. Silent witnesses to childhoods shaped by boarding schools and emotional reserve appeared almost closer. William looked directly at the aide. Resilience is not built by oversight, he said quietly. It is built by trust. A pause. And trust begins with care. The aide held his ground. No harm occurred. No harm occurred, William repeated, because she is fortunate, not because the system functioned. The words carried neither fury nor tremor, only clarity. The emotional midpoint of the confrontation settled here, between legacy and evolution. For centuries, the monarchy had prized composure above comfort. Children were raised within structured attachment to prepare for duty. Sentiment was often viewed as vulnerability. But this generation had made a promise, to modernize without dismantling dignity, to preserve tradition without inheriting its blind spots. William stepped away from the table and walked slowly along the gallery wall. His fingers brushed lightly against the carved wood beneath a portrait of a child monarch crowned before adolescence. They endured, he said softly, almost to himself. Then he turned back. But endurance without choice is not strength. It is compliance. No one interrupted. The aide who had authorized the directive stood straighter. With respect, sir, the system has operated this way for generations. And that, William replied, is precisely the problem. A subtle intake of breath rippled through the room, because in that sentence lay rupture. He was not merely correcting a decision. He was challenging culture. The confrontation sharpened. Complaints were redirected. William continued. Approval was bypassed. Language minimized discomfort. All to preserve what? Efficiency? Optics? The private secretary attempted reassurance. There was no malicious intent. I am not concerned with malice, William said. I am concerned with mindset. The camera would linger on faces now. Loyal servants of the crown, individuals who had dedicated decades to seamless operation. They were not villains. They were products of a system optimized for discretion, and discretion had quietly outranked empathy. A quiet voice from the back, one of the deputy aides, spoke hesitantly. The culture assumes durability, sir. It assumes that heirs are raised to withstand. William's expression softened, but only slightly. She is not an heir tonight, he said. She is a child. The room fell utterly silent. That sentence marked a pivot. No longer policy debate, moral reckoning. Outside, clouds drifted across a pale sky above palace rooftops. Guards continued their rotations beyond iron gates. The public remained unaware. But inside the long gallery, something irreversible was unfolding. The senior aide who had authorized the directive lowered his gaze briefly. If we erred, he said, it was in loyalty. William regarded him carefully. Loyalty to whom? A beat. To the crown. William's reply was measured. The crown is not diminished by compassion. He stepped toward the center of the gallery. It is strengthened by it. Minutes passed in controlled discussion. Procedural clarifications, review processes, accountability mapping. But the emotional undercurrent remained dominant. Midway through the session, another revelation surfaced. An internal advisory from years prior, quietly archived, had recommended revising child welfare classifications across royal residences. The proposal had stalled. Why? It was considered unnecessary, the household marshal admitted. No incidents had escalated. Until one did. The confrontation had reached its crest. William exhaled slowly. Effective immediately, he said. Temporary accommodation protocols for minors require direct parental sign-off. No exceptions. A rustle of acknowledgement. Additionally, all welfare complaints bypass domestic operations and route directly to my office. The private secretary nodded. Understood, sir. But William had not finished. The individual who authorized non-escalation will step down pending review. The senior aide absorbed the statement with composure. If that is your decision, sir, it is. There was no triumph in the room, only gravity, because loyalty had collided with evolution, and evolution had prevailed. The gallery doors opened quietly at the session's close. Staff dispersed in near silence. Conversations would ripple later in controlled tones, but for now, reflection dominated. William remained alone beneath the watchful eyes of history. The camera would widen slowly, portraits receding into shadow as afternoon light softened. He understood the cost. Institutional change unsettles equilibrium. It invites scrutiny. It fractures long-standing comfort. But tradition that refuses examination calcifies. Hours later, Catherine joined him briefly in the gallery. It's done, she asked gently. It's begun, he replied. They stood side by side, looking down the length of the corridor. This isn't about a room, she said. No, he answered quietly. It never was. Outside, staff quarters felt different. Not chaotic, not rebellious, but aware. Loyalty within the palace had always been firm. Yet now, loyalty was being redefined. Not as protection from inconvenience, but protection from indifference. The machinery of the crown had been confronted, not dismantled, but recalibrated. And as evening descended over Kensington, word spread carefully through internal channels. Oversight reforms forthcoming. Leadership review underway. Child first directive imminent. The ensign notation was no longer secret. It was a catalyst. Because sometimes, transformation does not begin with revolution. It begins with a single sentence spoken in a gallery lined with ghosts. She is not an heir tonight. She is a child. The emotional dust had not yet settled, and as loyalty fractured within the staff, William now faced a new dilemma, one heavier than confrontation. Should this remain internal? Or should transparency redefine accountability? The monarchy survives through discretion, but evolution demands visibility. The choice ahead would determine not only culture, but credibility. The long gallery had emptied hours ago, yet its silence lingered like a held breath. Portraits that had witnessed coronations and abdications now bore quiet witness to something subtler, an heir who had not shouted, yet had unsettled generations of unspoken understanding. By evening, Kensington Palace felt altered, not visibly. The gates still stood. Guards still rotated with ceremonial precision. But in the staff corridors beneath the private apartments, footsteps softened. Conversations paused when doors opened. Efficiency remained, but it was cautious now. William stood alone in his study, the ensign notation placed neatly atop a stack of historical files retrieved from archival storage. He had requested them after the confrontation, not disciplinary files. Child welfare records. The camera would lower into the subterranean archive rooms beneath the palace. Climate control vaults where boxes of correspondence, memoranda, and internal advisories were preserved with almost sacred care. Letters from tutors. Reports from governesses. Notes from equerries describing the temperament of young heirs. Language from another era. Structured detachment advised. Emotional correction preferable to indulgence. Character strengthened through austerity. Words once considered wise. Now, under modern light, they felt brittle. Hours earlier, Catherine had joined him in the archive chamber. She wore no expression of outrage, only reflection. They believed they were building fortitude, she had said quietly, brushing dust from the spine of a leather-bound ledger. They were, William replied. But fortitude for what? The monarchy's history was layered with resilience, wartime broadcasts, constitutional crises. Public scandal endured with composed silence. But private childhood records revealed something less celebrated. Loneliness, distance, a tradition preparing heirs for isolation before they understood companionship. William ran his fingers over an internal memorandum dated decades earlier. It referenced temporary accommodation during renovations at Buckingham Palace. Language nearly identical to the directive that had surfaced this week. Provisional bedding acceptable within tolerance thresholds. Tolerance thresholds. A phrase capable of shrinking empathy into a metric. The palace was not cruel. It was conditioned. Conditioned to preserve composure above all. Conditioned to shield principles from domestic inconvenience in order to protect image. And image, over time, had quietly displaced intimacy. Upstairs, Charlotte's room glowed softly beneath a bedside lamp. The restored bed stood solid against the wall, linens freshly pressed. She slept without awareness of institutional tremor. But William did not sleep easily. The confrontation had resolved accountability in part, but reform required more than dismissal. It required architecture. The camera would drift through corridors at midnight, past silent reception rooms, beneath chandeliers dimmed low, across marble floors reflecting moonlight. The palace at night feels suspended between centuries. William sat at his desk, drafting what would become the Child Welfare Review Directive. Language measured, formal, unemotional on the surface. But beneath each clause lived memory of a hardwood floor. He paused midway through the draft. Because reform inside a monarchy must be precise. Too abrupt, it fractures continuity. Too gentle, and it evaporates into symbolism. Meanwhile, unease rippled through staff ranks. The senior aide who had authorized non-escalation had vacated his office pending review. Personal effects boxed discreetly. No announcement made beyond internal memo. But absence speaks. Junior staff felt the shift most acutely. For years, they had navigated deference as both shield and compass. Now the compass needle trembled. What constituted overstepping? What required escalation? Silence, once safe, felt uncertain. The next morning, William convened a smaller, private consultation. Not in the long gallery, but in a modest meeting room adjacent to the family quarters. Present, Catherine, the private secretary, a newly appointed welfare advisor with experience in child psychology, and a senior legal consultant versed in constitutional precedent. No portraits here. No theatrical weight. Just conversation. The issue is not one decision, Catherine began calmly. It is inherited mindset. The welfare advisor nodded. In institutional environments, she said, empathy can become procedural. Care becomes checklists. William listened without interruption. If we frame this as correction, he said finally, we risk defensiveness. If we frame it as evolution, we invite participation. The legal consultant cleared his throat. Public acknowledgement, he cautioned gently, introduces constitutional optics. The Crown rarely addresses internal domestic matters. There was again, optics. William leaned back. And if we remain silent? Tradition remains intact, the consultant replied. But trust? William asked quietly. The room held still. Because the monarchy's survival has always balanced two forces, mystery and relevance. Too much transparency risks diminishing mystique. Too little risks irrelevance. The emotional midpoint of this chapter settles here, in deliberation rather than confrontation. William requested comparative records from Windsor Castle and other residences. Patterns emerged, not identical incidents, but similar language, temporary, acceptable, within tolerance. No harm observed. Each phrase individually harmless, collectively revealing. Later that afternoon, William walked the ground alone. Winter air carried the scent of damp earth. Bare branches traced fragile lines against gray sky. He remembered his own childhood corridors, structured schedules, expectations articulated before adolescence. There had been love, but there had also been distance. He stopped near the garden's edge, watching a single leaf loosen from branch and fall without ceremony. Tradition does not fall loudly. It detaches quietly. Catherine joined him moments later. You're weighing public reform, she observed gently. I'm weighing precedent, he replied. If you announce change, it becomes irreversible. Yes, and if you don't, it remains vulnerable to repetition. The camera would circle them slowly, the palace rising behind in dignified silhouette. They had promised, upon marriage, to modernize royal culture without eroding its foundation, to humanize without destabilizing. Now the test had arrived, not through scandal, but through subtle neglect. Back inside, drafts of the Child First Welfare Directive began to take shape. Key provisions: no provisional accommodation for minors without parental authorization, mandatory escalation of welfare complaints beyond domestic operations, annual independent review of child welfare protocols across royal residences, direct reporting channel to principal parent, language clean, institutional, firm, but reform required symbolic weight as well. That evening, William returned once more to the nursery doorway. Charlotte stirred slightly in sleep. A small sigh, nothing more. He stepped inside and adjusted her blanket, a gesture so ordinary it would never enter a ledger. Yet in that moment, monarchy and fatherhood intersected not as tension, but as alignment. The silence before reform is heavier than confrontation, because, once announced, change cannot retreat. Midnight approached again. The palace exhaled. In administrative offices below, staff reviewed new draft language circulated quietly for internal comment. Some felt relief, others unease. Was this modernization or erosion? One junior staff member whispered to another, "It feels different." It was because the reform was not born from public criticism. It was born from private conviction. And that distinction mattered. By the following morning, the directive was complete. William signed it without flourish. No cameras, no press release, just ink meeting paper beneath steady hand. The legal consultant confirmed implementation procedures. The welfare advisor outlined training adjustments. The private secretary prepared internal circulation. The palace, outwardly unchanged, had shifted axis. But William had not yet answered the final question. Should this remain entirely internal? Or should a broader message, subtle yet unmistakable, be delivered about evolving royal culture? He stood once more before the long gallery, now empty and echoing. Portraits stared down with painted composure. He did not resent them. He simply refused to replicate them unexamined. The camera would pull slowly back to the corridor, past carved beams and polished floors, through archways and stairwells, out toward the palace facade under pale winter sun. The monarchy remained intact, but something within its walls had matured. Reform is rarely loud inside ancient institutions. It begins in silence, in study rooms at midnight, in archives beneath stone, in a father's refusal to inherit indifference. And now, with evidence assembled and resolve hardened, the next step would cross a threshold that could not be uncrossed. The silence that followed deliberation was heavier than confrontation. For days, the corridors of Kensington Palace had moved in careful rhythm. Staff precise, conversations measured, eyes briefly lowered in thought rather than fear. The reform draft had circulated. Edits had been returned. Legal phrasing refined. Advisory language softened in places, sharpened in others. But now, deliberation had ended. The line had been drawn. It would not be crossed again. The announcement was not made from a balcony, not delivered beneath chandeliers before assembled dignitaries. It unfolded instead in a private staff assembly within the palace's principal briefing room, a space more functional than ceremonial, where daily operations were normally reviewed without spectacle. Rows of staff stood in formal alignment: domestic supervisors, administrative aides, security liaisons, senior household officers. No press, no public statement, only those whose work sustained the crown from behind its facade. William entered without escort. He did not stand at the podium immediately. Instead, he surveyed the room, not as sovereign in waiting, but as custodian of something larger than protocol. The strength of this institution, he began, voice calm and unembellished, has always rested upon discipline and discretion. A pause. And those qualities remain indispensable. Shoulders straightened slightly in affirmation. But discipline without accountability, he continued, erodes trust, and discretion without compassion diminishes purpose. No one shifted now, because the words were neither accusatory nor abstract. They were precise. The temporary accommodation decision regarding my daughter, he said evenly, revealed a procedural compliance that failed a moral standard. He did not dramatize it. He did not describe hardwood floors. He did not recount midnight discoveries. The details were unnecessary. You followed policy, he acknowledged, but policy was insufficient. The camera will move slowly across attentive faces, some loyal for decades, some new to service. Individuals who had given their professional lives to seamless function. He was not dismantling their loyalty. He was refining its direction. Effective immediately, William said. A child-first welfare directive is enacted across all royal residences. He allowed the weight of that sentence to settle. The private secretary stood nearby with printed copies. They were distributed in silence. Key provisions were outlined. No provisional accommodation for minors without direct parental authorization. Mandatory escalation of welfare concerns beyond domestic operations. Independent annual review of child welfare protocols. Direct reporting access to principal parents for any staff member with concern. No exceptions. No emergency classification loopholes. No tolerance thresholds. William's tone remained steady. This is not a rejection of tradition, he clarified. It is a refinement of it. He paused, then added quietly, legacy means nothing if humanity is compromised. The words lingered. For some in the room, they felt like correction. For others, liberation. Because beneath decades of deference, there had always been individuals uneasy with silent tolerance, but uncertain how to challenge it. Now the structure had shifted. The senior aide who had authorized non-escalation was not present. His review had concluded earlier that morning. Relief of duty, discreet, respectful, unmistakable. 2 security officers had escorted him from administrative quarters at dawn, not as punishment, but as consequence. His departure had not been announced publicly, but absence, again, spoke. The crown does not humiliate. It recalibrates. After outlining the directive, William stepped away from the podium and allowed the room to breathe. Questions were invited. A junior domestic coordinator raised her hand tentatively. Sir, if a concern arises during external engagements, when you are abroad, for instance, How should escalation proceed? Directly, William replied. No buffering. No filtering. Clarity. Another staff member asked about contractors scheduling conflicts. Adjust them, he said simply. We will not accommodate convenience at the expense of care. There was no anger in his voice, only finality. The meeting concluded not with applause, but with collective stillness, because something fundamental had shifted. For generations, the palace operated on an assumption that heirs were molded by endurance. Now, endurance would not be engineered. Care would not be optional. As staff dispersed, conversation resumed in low, thoughtful tones. Some felt uncertainty. Change unsettles even when necessary. Others felt relief, as though a weight long unspoken had been acknowledged. The camera would follow William to the corridor after the assembly, past carved moldings and portraits that seemed less imposing now. Catherine waited near the private wing. It's done, he said quietly. She searched his expression. And order will return, he replied. But it will be different. That afternoon, the directive was transmitted to administrative offices at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. Formal language, institutional tone, but its implications were clear. Child welfare oversight now outranked ceremonial convenience across royal households. The crown had adapted, not under public pressure, not under scandal, but under conviction. As evening approached, William addressed a smaller gathering of senior officers in a long gallery, the same space where confrontation had unfolded days earlier. The atmosphere was calmer now, measured. I do not question your loyalty, he began, but loyalty must align with principle. He moved slowly along the length of the gallery as he spoke. The crown has survived because it evolves when necessary, quietly, thoughtfully, without spectacle. He paused beneath the portrait of a young monarch painted centuries earlier. That evolution continues now. No grand gestures, no declarations of revolution, only alignment. After the meeting, he remained alone once more in the gallery. Sunlight faded through tall windows, casting elongated shadows across polished floors. He did not feel triumph. Reform is rarely triumphant. It is steady, intentional, sometimes heavy. Later that night, he walked again toward the nursery. The hallway felt warmer somehow, though no temperature had changed. Charlotte slept peacefully beneath soft lamplight, her breathing even, her hand curled loosely around the edge of her pillow. He stood in the doorway longer than necessary, because this moment was no longer about protocol. It was about identity, the kind of king he intended to become. Authority expressed through distance had defined generations, but authority expressed through protection, that would define his. The camera would pull back slowly from the nursery threshold, down the corridor, through archways, and out toward the palace facade under evening sky. The institution remained intact. Guards stood unmoved. The flag above remained raised. But inside, hierarchy had been recalibrated. Care now outranked convenience. Compassion now outranked optics. The line had been drawn. It would not be crossed again. And as calm settled into the rhythm of palace life, William lingered a moment longer in the doorway, aware that reform is not a single act, but a commitment renewed daily. He turned off the hallway light softly. Behind him, the palace rested. Before him lay a reign not yet begun, but already defined by choice. The nursery was quiet again. Weeks had passed since the long gallery confrontation, since the ensign notation, since the reform that moved through the palace like a subtle shift in gravity. Outwardly, nothing dramatic had occurred. No public statements, no headlines, no ceremonial acknowledgments. And yet within the walls of Kensington Palace, the atmosphere felt recalibrated. Staff no longer whispered about escalation. They understood it. Welfare channels operated without hesitation. Renovation schedules now included secondary contingencies as standard procedure. The child-first directive had settled into routine, not as disruption, but as alignment. Order had returned, but it was a different order. The camera would move slowly through the palace at dawn, light stretching gently across courtyard stone, guards changing shifts with ceremonial precision, the city of London stirring beyond iron gates. The institution stood exactly as it always had, and yet Something within its culture had evolved. Upstairs, Charlotte slept in her restored room. The bed stood solid and warm beneath layered linen. A small stuffed rabbit rested near her shoulder. She would never remember the hardwood floor, the folded blanket, the midnight visit. She did not need to. Some lessons are not meant for children to carry. They are meant for institutions. William stood once more at the nursery threshold, not in urgency now, but in quiet reflection. The hallway lamp cast soft light across carved moldings, and for a moment, time seemed suspended between past and future. The monarchy, by design, exists beyond individual lifetimes. It carries memory forward in ritual and stone, but its strength has never come from stone alone. It comes from choice. The choice to remain silent or to speak, to preserve comfort or to protect vulnerability, to inherit tradition unquestioned or to refine it. The camera would drift toward the window overlooking palace gardens. Morning mist hovered low against trimmed hedges. Somewhere beyond those walls, the public moved about their ordinary routines, unaware of the subtle transformation that had occurred within the royal household. They would likely never know the details, but they would feel its effects, because leadership expressed privately shapes credibility expressed publicly. In the weeks following reform, internal reviews at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle confirmed compliance. Training sessions emphasized not just procedural accuracy, but ethical sensitivity. The language of tolerance thresholds quietly disappeared from operational documents. It was not a revolution. It was a recalibration. Catherine joined William in the sitting room later that morning. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes suspended in air like fragments of history. "You're quieter," she observed gently. "Am I?" "Yes." Not troubled. Reflective. He considered that. "When I was young," he said slowly, "strength was often described as distance." She listened without interruption. "Distance can preserve authority," he continued, "but it does not always preserve trust." Catherine smiled faintly. "Trust," she said, "is rarely ceremonial. No, it is built in doorways at 2 a.m., in decisions no one sees, in reforms that never reach headlines." The narrator's voice would soften here. The unseen burdens of monarchy are not only constitutional, they are emotional. To carry both symbolism and fatherhood, to balance silence with action, to honor legacy without replicating its blind spots. That is the quiet architecture of modern royalty. William walked the palace grounds that afternoon, alone. The winter air was crisp, branches bare against pale sky. Each step across gravel felt deliberate, though no audience watched. He thought of the portraits in the long gallery. Young faces crowned too early, children trained for duty before understanding its cost. He did not resent them. He understood them. They had done what was required in their time. Now his time required something different. Authority expressed through protection. The camera would rise above the palace slowly, rooftops arranged in symmetrical discipline, flags lifting in soft wind, the city beyond alive with motion. The monarchy remained standing, but within its walls, hierarchy no longer placed optics above care. The child-first directive had become part of the institution's bloodstream, a new baseline. That evening, William returned once more to the nursery, not from anxiety, not from urgency, but from habit. Charlotte stirred lightly as he adjusted her blanket. A small exhale, nothing more. In that quiet moment, the weight of crown and fatherhood did not feel like tension. They felt aligned. Because sometimes leadership is measured not in speeches delivered beneath chandeliers, nor in ceremonies broadcast to millions. Sometimes it is measured in who sleeps comfortably behind closed doors. The camera would linger here, on the softness of lamplight, on the steady rhythm of a child's breathing, on the silhouette of father standing watch not as ruler, but as guardian. Outside, the palace exhaled. Staff moved with renewed clarity. Guards maintained their posts. The machinery of the crown turned as it always had, efficient, disciplined, composed. But its compass had shifted, and that shift would ripple forward, long after this night faded into memory, because institutions do not transform through spectacle alone. They transform when someone inside them decides that inherited indifference will not be passed on. William stepped back into the hallway and closed the nursery door softly. He did not linger in dramatic contemplation. He simply stood for a moment in stillness, contemplating not power, but responsibility. The kind of king he intended to become would not be defined by endurance alone. It would be defined by attentiveness, by the refusal to allow small harms to hide beneath acceptable language, by the belief that dignity and compassion are not competing virtues. They are partners. The narrator's voice lowers further now. History often records the grand gestures, the speeches, the coronations, the crises. But sometimes history is rewritten in silence, in reforms that never trend, in accountability enacted without humiliation, in care elevated quietly above convenience. As dawn approaches once more over Kensington Palace, the institution stands unchanged to the eye, yet something within its walls has matured. A generational shift not announced, but lived. Charlotte will grow, as all children do, into her understanding of duty. She will learn the weight of her name, the discipline of her position, but she will also inherit something subtle and powerful, the knowledge, unspoken yet embedded, that her comfort mattered. And if that principle can reshape a palace, it can reshape a reign. The camera rises above the rooftops one final time. London awakens. The crown endures, but it endures differently now, measured not only by tradition, measured by care.